150 years ago, the land that I'm standing on was a village of the Squamish Nation called Sanok. It's now in the urban heart of Vancouver. On the far side of me, a massive housing development is under construction that will involve residential towers over 50 stories tall. All of this could seem to fit into a familiar narrative of the dying Indian, according to which a proud and noble people that lived off the land tragically but inevitably had to give way to modernity. The trouble with this narrative is that it's bullshit. It's bullshit morally in the sense that it makes out the cultural devastation of the indigenous people to be a tragic inevitability, when in fact it was the product of deliberate and avoidable political choices, both past and present. And is bullshit factually in the sense that the indigenous people of North America haven't died or disappeared. In fact, their numbers are growing. The land that I'm standing on is Squamish land, not just as a matter of principle, but as a matter of legal fact. And that housing development is owned and is being directed by the Squamish Nation. The name of the housing development is Sanok. The indigenous people of North America have shown imagination and resourcefulness in adapting themselves to the settler cultures on their land while remaining true to their traditions. The question remains whether those settler cultures, made up of people like me, can show equal amounts of resourcefulness and imagination in adapting ourselves to and learning from the traditions of the indigenous people who have been on this land from time immemorial. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a trained plant ecologist and also an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And she's built a career out of bridging between Western scientific ways of knowing and traditional indigenous ways of knowing. She's best known for this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that was published about a decade ago and has become a big hit. It deals with ways in which both Western scientific and indigenous traditions can help us develop a healthier and more wholesome relationship to the land that we live on. Now, Kimmerer is a strong advocate of what is sometimes known as traditional ecological knowledge, or TEC for short. And the basic idea behind traditional ecological knowledge is that a group of people who have a long-standing relationship to an area, one where they subsist off and live off the various products in that area, have an understanding of, a knowledge about that land that is different from the kind of knowledge you could acquire through scientific research. And I think there's three principal ways in which traditional ecological knowledge differs from scientific knowledge. The first is that, as I mentioned before, traditional ecological knowledge relies on long-term observation. It's a multi-generational project where people across generations come to a deep understanding of the land, the kinds of cycles it goes through, and so on and so forth, that's just different from the kind of knowledge you could acquire in a few years of running scientific studies. The second difference is that it's very place-specific, that this is a knowledge that is deeply rooted in and connected to a particular kind of ecosystem, a particular kind of land, which again differs from a Western scientific model that generally aspires to general principles that can be applied in a wide range of settings. And the third is that traditional ecological knowledge tends to be encoded in cultural practices more generally, in rituals, in mythology, in cosmology, in general symbolism and storytelling. And the thought is that a culture in its way of being is exhibiting a kind of adaptedness to the land that they live on. And so understanding the whole way in which that culture relates to the world helps you see a deep sense of understanding of what that land is and what it requires in order to live on it sustainably. Now, traditional ecological knowledge has become a topic of some interest because in settler colonial cultures like the one I live in Canada, indigenous knowledge for most of the colonial period was simply dismissed or ignored. And increasingly, especially in the domain of resource management, government bodies are starting to recognize the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and are learning to partner with indigenous groups in finding more sustainable ways of relating to the land. Now, Kimmerer develops a series of guidelines or principles for how to relate in a sustainable way with the land that she calls the honorable harvest. And she makes clear that she's not writing down some set of hard and fast rules. She's certainly not drawing it from any particular source, but rather you might say, trying to gather together and provide a loose codification of some of the ways in which indigenous cultures have related to the land. And in particular, there's a whole process of permission asking and thanksgiving that is involved in harvesting both plants and animals from the land. The thought is that you need to ask permission, not just of the animals that you may hunt for food, but even of the plants that you want to harvest. And you also have to give thanks. And along the way, there's a whole further series of steps that typically need to be taken. You should never take the first, never take the last. And you should always share. You should always never take more than half of what's available. And the idea is that this builds, first of all, a sustainable relationship with the land so that there is more in the next year, the next season, so that you're not taking everything all at once, but one that relies on a deep sense of gratitude and reciprocity with the land. And I think this captures a sense of what it is to be a part of an ecosystem that is distinctive of traditional ecological knowledge. Kimmerer, drawing on the science part of her knowledge, talks about the dilemma of being a heterotroph. So heterotrophs, animals and fungi are heterotrophs, unlike plants, which are autotrophs. Plants are able to source their own energy simply by drawing on the energy of the sun. They don't need to feed on other living organisms unless they're parasitic plants, but the sort of standard plant doesn't need to do that. Whereas animals like you and me, as well as other animals and as well as fungi, can't photosynthesize. The only way we can eat is by feeding on other living organisms. And this, I think, is an interesting dilemma that goes deeper than the sort of problem that you encounter if you take seriously a commitment to vegetarianism or veganism. There, the issue is simply that I don't want to eat other animals. But the point that Kimmerer draws on, and again, here I think she's drawing on indigenous traditions, is to say that even if you don't want to eat animals, you're still eating plants, and plants are living things too. That there's no escaping the fact that in order to live, human beings have to feed on other life. And so the issue is not whether you can abstain from killing, but rather a question of how you might do justice to the things that sustain you, the foods that you eat. So rather than coming up with some kind of rules of strict vegetarianism, typical indigenous diet is omnivorous, but omnivorous in a way that respects and gives thanks to all the organisms, animal and plant and fungi, that are involved in keeping people alive. Now, these practices of asking permission and giving thanks and so on, I think raise some really interesting philosophical questions. So when Kimmerer goes out into the forest and she asks the permission of wild leeks to harvest them before she takes any, does she literally believe that the leeks can hear her? Does she literally believe the leeks answer back? Now, I don't know what Kimmerer would say in response to that question, but my sense is that that is the wrong question to ask. It's a way of applying a certain Western framework in a context that just doesn't really suit that framework. I think rather than asking about what people think or what they believe, it makes more sense to start simply by looking at what they do and how this form of action feeds into a broader understanding and a broader way of life. So start with the fact that this is what she does, and then recognize how that practice of asking permission and giving thanks then feeds into a broader way of life that does seem to work. It seems to reinforce a sustainable relationship with the land. And to the extent that you want to then theorize about what is being believed, you need to theorize that in terms of a way of relating to the land that clearly has been shown to be sustainable and to work. Another question that I think arises with traditional ecological knowledge is how it finds application in a global setting. Now, obviously, as much as any time, there are local problems and local situations that we need to deal with, and there traditional ecological knowledge has lost none of its significance and importance. But I think there's two bigger contexts that raise some interesting questions about what it means to engage with them in an honorable way, according to indigenous traditions or according to indigenous teachings. So the first, broadly speaking, is what I might call capitalism or global capitalism. The fact that the things that I use, I mean, if you just look at sort of the background here, are products that are sourced from all sorts of different places in the world. They're highly processed in a way that means that, I don't know not only where these things come from, but Most of the more complex products I have involve parts that probably come from all sorts of different places in the world. So how do I then engage honorably with products whose provenance I don't know anything about, and where the provenance of those products is comes to me through the means of a market system? So it's worth emphasizing that this idea of asking permission and giving thanks all features in part of what you might call a gift economy. The idea that exchange is a matter of building close personal relationships, and one where both parties to the exchange are brought closer together through the exchange. Whereas a market economy is much more anonymous. I give you some money, you give me some stuff I want. We don't have to have any kind of closeness to one another. And that's the way in which I get most of the stuff, the food I eat, the books I read, the iPhone I'm staring at right now. So is there a way that I can engage in the world in a sustainable and honorable way when I don't have that relationship to the land? And the other question, I think, is how traditional ecological knowledge interfaces with global problems like climate change. That if it's a form of knowing that's very particular to place, how do we bring it to bear on these larger global problems? And again, I think there's an obvious answer there, that if in all our various localized settings we have a more sustainable relationship to the earth, we're going to stop creating a global mess. But I think there are some interesting questions to explore there about what it means to translate and make use of these traditional forms of knowing in a context that is significantly different from the ones in which they were originally developed. This is not to say that they don't have application, but rather to say that people like Kimmerer are doing really interesting work in exploring how traditional ecological knowledge can be extended to settings that involve both market exchange and ecological problems that have a global reach.